The plane soared high above the clouds, the hum of the engines vibrating through the sleek cabin. Inside first class, passengers settled into their seats, enjoying the comfort and luxury that came with a higher price. But all of that changed in an instant. A flight attendant, stern and brisk, marched down the aisle with a look of determination. Her eyes were fixed on one particular seat in first class, a woman, sitting there quietly, as if she were meant to be there. The attendant's face twisted into an expression of disapproval as she approached the woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice cold and sharp. "You're not supposed to be here." The woman, who had been staring out the window, turned her head slowly. There was no sign of surprise, no trace of panic. She simply looked at the flight attendant with a calm, almost indifferent gaze. "I beg your pardon," the woman replied, her voice soft but firm. The attendant stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "This is first class, and you are not allowed here. You need to leave immediately." There was a brief silence, the kind that made the air feel thick with tension. The woman did not move. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to her feet. She just stared at the attendant, as if the request was of no consequence to her at all. "Ma'am, I am serious. Please get up." The attendant's voice was louder now, demanding. But still, the woman sat, unmoving, her calmness only deepening the tension. The other passengers began to shift in their seats, some peering over their shoulders to witness the growing exchange. It wasn't often that first class experienced this kind of disruption. The flight attendant's voice grew sharper, more insistent. "You do not belong here. Get up and move to your assigned seat." The woman's lips curled into a small smile, but her eyes remained focused, unbothered. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I am exactly where I need to be." The attendant, now visibly frustrated, crossed her arms. "I'm giving you one last chance. Leave or I will have to involve security." The words hung in the air, as if the flight attendant was hoping her threat would break the woman's resolve. But there was no sign of fear, no sign of hesitation. The woman simply continued to look ahead, her hands resting calmly in her lap. It was then that something strange happened. The woman's gaze shifted, just slightly, towards the aisle where the flight attendant had come from. A subtle change in her demeanor, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the attendant pause. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the woman that she couldn't place. Something different. And it made her uneasy. "Are you really going to test me?" the flight attendant demanded, her voice tight with frustration. But before the woman could respond, something caught the flight attendant's eye. A small, almost unnoticeable detail, the woman's hand. It wasn't the hand of someone ordinary. It wasn't just a hand holding a book or a phone. There was something more there. The flight attendant couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt a wave of unease wash over her. Then it hit her. Something was terribly wrong. She had just made a dangerous mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The woman's lips didn't move, but the flight attendant could have sworn she heard the faintest chuckle, as if the woman knew something the attendant didn't. Something that made her realize, she had no idea who she was dealing with. And with that realization, the tension in the cabin escalated. The passengers leaned forward, watching closely, waiting for what would happen next. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, her eyes scanning the woman seated before her. The calmness that radiated from the woman made the attendant's heart race, her earlier confidence now turning into doubt. What was going on here? Why was this woman so unbothered by the situation? There was no fear, no panic. Just a calm, collected presence that made the flight attendant feel small in comparison. "Ma'am," the flight attendant started again, her voice trembling slightly. "I need you to leave first class, or I will have no choice but to call for security." But the woman just sat there, unmoving. It was as though she hadn't heard the flight attendant at all. The faintest smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but she said nothing in return. The attendant's hand twitched as she reached for her walkie-talkie. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their whispers and glances making the situation feel even more charged. It wasn't every day that a flight attendant had to deal with someone who refused to follow instructions, let alone in first class. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the usual calm and luxury of the section completely shattered. "You're really going to make me do this?" The flight attendant's voice was louder now, almost desperate. The woman's lack of response was grating on her nerves, and the more she stared at the woman, the more unsettling the situation became. Something was off, something she couldn't explain. The woman finally turned her head, slowly, to face the flight attendant. There was no anger in her eyes, no annoyance. Just calm understanding. As if she knew exactly what was happening, and that it didn't concern her in the slightest. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat when she noticed the woman's eyes, sharp, calculating, like she was sizing her up, dissecting her every move. The flight attendant instinctively took a step back. What was it about this woman that made her feel so uncomfortable? "I've told you already," the woman said, her voice smooth and even. "You don't need to call security. There's no reason for this to escalate." The flight attendant shook her head, her mind racing. Why didn't she just follow orders like everyone else? Why wasn't she cowering like the rest of the passengers would in this situation? Her hand tightened around the walkie-talkie, the device suddenly feeling too heavy in her grip. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. The woman's smile widened, almost as if she could hear the attendant's thoughts. "You're not really in control here, are you?" A chill ran down the flight attendant's spine. The words were casual, almost dismissive, but the weight they carried was undeniable. The flight attendant had thought she was in charge. She had assumed that her authority as a flight attendant was enough to make anyone comply. But this woman, she was different. There was something about her that suggested she had power, real power. As the flight attendant stood there, struggling to regain her composure, one of the passengers in the back of the cabin stood up. A man, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing curiosity, stepped forward. "Excuse me, miss," he called to the flight attendant, his voice calm but firm. "I think you should let the lady stay. There's no need to make a scene." The flight attendant spun around to face him, her face flushed with embarrassment. Who did he think he was, interfering with her work? But when she looked at him, her heart skipped a beat. The man wasn't just another passenger, he was someone who could change everything. "Are you seriously going to let this happen?" the flight attendant snapped, trying to regain some of the control she had lost. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he stood there, silently watching her, as if waiting for her to realize something. The woman in the first-class seat glanced at the man for a split second, then looked back at the flight attendant. "Maybe it's time for you to reassess who you're talking to," she said, her voice carrying an air of quiet authority. The flight attendant's pulse quickened. What was happening here? Why did she feel so out of her depth? The woman wasn't just challenging her authority, she was toying with her, making her question everything she thought she knew about this situation. The man in the back of the cabin simply nodded, as if in agreement with the woman. "Let it go," he said. "You've made your point." The flight attendant's thoughts were racing, but her instincts were screaming at her that this wasn't just about first class anymore. This was something much bigger, and she had no idea how deep it went. The flight attendant stood there, frozen, her hand still clutching the walkie-talkie as though it might offer some reassurance. The quiet confidence of the woman in first class was unnerving. The words of the man in the back of the cabin echoed in her mind, "Let it go." She wanted to, but something about the situation wouldn't let her. The power dynamic had shifted. She could feel it, like an invisible force that pressed against her chest. The other passengers were watching, some whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. The man in the back had spoken, and his calm demeanor seemed to command respect. It was as if everyone knew something the flight attendant didn't. And that realization made her stomach churn. You don't understand," the flight attendant stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm just doing my job." The woman in the first-class seat didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at the attendant, her eyes calm and unfazed. It was as though the flight attendant's words were nothing more than background noise. A flicker of a smile crossed the woman's face, one that suggested she knew far more than anyone realized. "Your job, huh?" the woman finally spoke, her tone light, but with an undertone that sent a shiver down the flight attendant's spine. "That's funny, because I didn't realize first class had such strict rules." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. She couldn't let this woman win. She had to assert her authority. She had to make the woman understand that she couldn't just sit there, ignoring her requests. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she noticed something strange. The woman's hand was resting casually on the armrest, but there was something about the way her fingers moved, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. The flight attendant couldn't help but stare at it. Then, it hit her. It wasn't just the way the woman sat. It was the way she carried herself, the way she exuded confidence without saying a word. It was the way she seemed to own the room without even trying. The flight attendant felt a sudden rush of panic, a creeping realization that she had underestimated this woman in every possible way. "Do you know who I am?" the flight attendant asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. The words were laced with a mix of desperation and challenge. She was grasping for something, anything, that might help her regain control of the situation. The woman's smile deepened, and for a moment, she almost seemed to enjoy the flight attendant's growing discomfort. "I have an idea," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing. "But I think it's time for you to find out for yourself." The flight attendant's heart raced. What did she mean by that? What was she implying? The man in the back of the cabin, who had been silently watching, took a step forward. "It's not worth it," he said quietly. "Let it go. You're out of your league." The flight attendant glanced at him, then back at the woman. She could feel the walls closing in, the suffocating weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. The woman had made it clear that this wasn't just about first class. This wasn't about a passenger and a flight attendant. This was something far bigger. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. The flight attendant suddenly realized that she wasn't in control anymore. She had no idea who this woman was or what kind of power she wielded, but she had made a terrible mistake in trying to challenge her. The cabin fell silent, and the tension was thick. The woman sat there, unbothered by the drama unfolding around her. Her eyes locked with the flight attendant's, and for a brief moment, the flight attendant felt as though the woman could see straight through her, like she was nothing more than an insignificant figure in a much larger story. "Please," the woman said softly, breaking the silence. "Let it go. There's no need for this to go any further." The flight attendant stood there, her mind racing, but the words wouldn't come. She knew she had been bested. This was no ordinary passenger, no ordinary situation. She had just made an enemy of someone who could easily destroy her career, and she had no idea how or why. The woman leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms and giving the flight attendant one final, knowing look. And with that, the flight attendant realized that she had lost. But more than that, she had no idea what she was really up against. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she turned away from the woman in first class. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to remain calm, even though every fiber of her being screamed to do something, anything, to regain control. She took a deep breath and glanced back down the aisle, trying to focus on anything other than the unsettling presence of the woman sitting in first class. But it was impossible. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of every passenger on her. They were watching, waiting for something to happen, but no one was speaking. It was as if they all knew the flight attendant was powerless in this situation, and they were content to let her fall from grace. The woman in first class hadn't said a word since their last exchange. She simply sat there, her gaze now fixed out the window as if she was no longer part of the drama unfolding around her. It was almost eerie how little she seemed to care. No fear. No anger. Just calm and control. The flight attendant's mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Who was she? Why was she so unbothered by the confrontation? More importantly, why had no one else in the cabin intervened to support the flight attendant? Was it because they recognized the woman's authority? Was it because they knew something the flight attendant didn't? She couldn't stop thinking about what the man in the back of the cabin had said, "You're out of your league." The words haunted her, their weight pressing down on her like an invisible hand. She had been so sure of herself before, confident in her role as a flight attendant, confident that she had control over the situation. But now, she wasn't so sure anymore. Something had changed, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The more she thought about it, the more the woman's calm demeanor unsettled her. It was as if the woman knew exactly how to make her feel small, insignificant. There was a power in her that the flight attendant had never encountered before. She glanced back at the woman in first class, who was still staring out the window. Her expression was unreadable, but the flight attendant could sense something, an underlying strength that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the woman had been through situations like this before, as if she had faced challenges far greater than a rude flight attendant trying to kick her out of first class. The flight attendant's mind was racing, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to make sense of everything. She had made a huge mistake. She had underestimated this woman, and now she was paying the price. The woman's indifference was more powerful than any verbal confrontation could ever be. She was unshaken. Unfazed. For a moment, the flight attendant stood there, paralyzed. She didn't know what to do. Her confidence had evaporated, and all she could do was watch as the woman remained calm and composed, as if the entire episode was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The silence stretched on, and the flight attendant's internal conflict grew. The power dynamics in the cabin had shifted, and it was clear that she was no longer in charge. She had been so quick to assert her authority, so sure that she could control the situation. But now, she was nothing more than a spectator in a story that was rapidly slipping beyond her control. And then, as if the universe had decided to remind her just how far she had fallen, the flight attendant's walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Miss, we need to speak," came the voice of her supervisor over the radio. The words hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just dealing with an unruly passenger anymore. This was escalating. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The way the supervisor had spoken, it was like she already knew what had happened. It was as though the situation with this woman was already being discussed at higher levels, and the flight attendant had just become an unwitting pawn in a much larger game. She grabbed the walkie-talkie, trying to steady her breathing. "Yes, I'll be right there," she responded, her voice strained, but she had no choice. She needed guidance. She needed someone to tell her what to do. As she turned to leave, she stole one last glance at the woman in first class. There was something about her, something that couldn't be explained by words alone. The way she carried herself, the quiet confidence, the unshakable aura of authority, it was like she had already won. And somehow, the flight attendant knew that the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle, her mind racing as she tried to prepare herself for the conversation that awaited her. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the weight of her mistake seemed to grow with every passing second. She had no idea what was about to unfold, but she knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary situation. Something much bigger was at play, and she was just beginning to realize how far out of her depth she truly was. As she approached the galley, the door to the cockpit opened briefly, and her supervisor stepped out. His face was serious, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of her. He didn't need to say a word for the flight attendant to know that he had already heard everything that had happened. She was certain that her mistake had been communicated to him, and the fear of what might come next made her stomach tighten. "Come on," her supervisor said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." The flight attendant followed him into the galley, and he shut the door behind them, blocking out the rest of the world. The hum of the engines and the soft chatter of passengers outside the cabin were muffled now, leaving only the two of them in the small, dimly lit space. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "What happened out there?" her supervisor asked, his voice clipped. He wasn't angry, but there was a coldness to his tone that made her feel even more vulnerable. I tried to ask the woman to leave first class," she began, her voice shaky. "But she wouldn't cooperate. She didn't respond like I expected. She just sat there, completely calm, and I couldn't get her to leave." Her supervisor raised an eyebrow. "You couldn't get her to leave? Did she give you trouble?" "No," the flight attendant replied quickly, "but she was different. There was something about her that made me feel like I was out of my league. Like she was in control, not me." She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "And then there was the man who spoke up. He told me to let it go. It's like everyone knew I was making a mistake." Her supervisor's face darkened, and he rubbed a hand over his chin. "We're not just dealing with any ordinary passenger here," he muttered. "Do you know who she is?" The flight attendant shook her head, her heart pounding. "No. I have no idea. But something's off about her. The way she carried herself, it was like she had power. Real power." Her supervisor exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he was piecing together something she couldn't see. "That's what I was afraid of." He paused, the tension in the air thickening. "This woman is not just a regular passenger. She's someone important. Someone you should never have crossed paths with." The flight attendant blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean? Who is she?" Her supervisor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to a nearby counter, pulling up a small tablet. He tapped a few buttons, and within seconds, the screen lit up with a picture of the woman from first class. Her heart sank as she saw the image. "This is her," the supervisor said, his voice grave. "This is the woman you just tried to throw out of first class." The flight attendant's eyes widened as she looked at the screen. The woman wasn't just a regular passenger, she was someone far more influential. In fact, she was one of the most powerful people in the business world, someone whose name the flight attendant had heard but never imagined she would encounter in person. She's the CEO of a global tech company," the flight attendant stammered. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her supervisor nodded. "Yes. And not just any CEO. She's a major player in the industry. Her company controls a significant portion of the market. Do you realize what you've just done?" The flight attendant's mouth went dry. Her mind raced, trying to process the information. She had no idea who the woman was. She had no idea she was dealing with someone so influential. And now, she had unknowingly crossed a line she could never uncross. "She's been traveling incognito," her supervisor continued. "Most people wouldn't recognize her without the proper context. But she's not someone you mess with. She's powerful, she has connections everywhere." The flight attendant felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The woman wasn't just some VIP who expected special treatment. She was someone who could make or break careers with a single word. She had made a serious mistake. "What do we do now?" the flight attendant asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her supervisor gave her a hard look. "You need to apologize. And I mean sincerely. Right now. You've caused enough trouble already." Before she could respond, the door to the galley opened, and the woman stepped inside, her presence immediately commanding the room. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat as she saw her, standing tall and poised, as if nothing had happened. The woman's eyes locked with the flight attendant's, and the air seemed to hum with a quiet intensity. The flight attendant was certain that she could feel the weight of the woman's power pressing against her. She could hardly bring herself to speak, but she knew what she had to do. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what happened," the flight attendant said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I made a terrible mistake." The woman looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Apology accepted," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But remember this next time, you never know who you're dealing with. And you never know who might be watching." With that, she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving the flight attendant standing there, her knees weak and her mind still reeling from the shocking turn of events. The flight attendant stood there, stunned, her mind struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. She had apologized, but the weight of the woman's statement lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. "You never know who you're dealing with." Those words echoed in her head like a warning bell, a lesson she would never forget. Her supervisor, still standing by the counter, didn't say a word. The silence between them felt suffocating. She could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm, and for the first time in her career, she felt the crushing weight of her own insignificance. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore, she was a small cog in a vast, complicated machine. And she had just crossed paths with someone who could dismantle that machine without a second thought. The woman had turned and walked back to her seat with an air of effortless authority, as if nothing had happened. But for the flight attendant, everything had changed. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes, and there was no going back. She had made a mistake, and she knew now that she would carry the consequences of that mistake with her for the rest of her life. "I don't think you fully grasp what just happened," her supervisor finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "She's not just any businesswoman. She's a force. A force that can break people with a single phone call." The flight attendant nodded, still struggling to find her words. "I had no idea. I thought she was just another passenger." "That's the problem," her supervisor replied. "You assumed. You saw a woman sitting in first class, and you thought you could throw her out like any other passenger. You didn't realize who she really was. And now, you're lucky she's decided to let this go." The words hit her hard. She had been reckless, and her actions could have had serious repercussions. But she had been saved, at least for now. The question was, why? Why had the woman not taken further action? Why had she simply accepted the apology and moved on? The flight attendant didn't have long to think about it, as the sound of the cabin door opening interrupted her thoughts. The woman, the CEO, was now walking down the aisle again, this time with a purposeful stride. She passed by the galley where the flight attendant and her supervisor stood, not even sparing them a glance. But the flight attendant could feel the power emanating from her, as if the very air around her had changed. She wasn't just walking back to her seat. She was making a statement. As the woman passed, she spoke again, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "I hope you've learned your lesson," she said, her eyes locking with the flight attendant's for a brief moment. The tone of her voice was almost like a challenge, but also an unspoken understanding. The flight attendant could feel the heat rise in her face, a mix of embarrassment and awe. "I have," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that she would never forget. The woman continued her walk, but the flight attendant couldn't take her eyes off her. The CEO's presence was magnetic, unstoppable. She moved like someone who was used to being in control, someone who had worked her entire life to get to where she was, and it was clear that nothing could shake her. The flight attendant's supervisor, who had been silent during this entire exchange, finally spoke again, his voice filled with a note of caution. "From now on, you'll need to be more careful. You've got a long way to go to make up for this mistake. The higher-ups won't forget. And neither will she." The flight attendant nodded, her mind still reeling. She couldn't erase what had happened, but she knew now that she would need to carry this lesson forward. She had underestimated someone, and she had paid the price for it. But the real challenge, she realized, wasn't just learning from this mistake, it was ensuring she never made it again. As the woman returned to her seat and the flight attendant turned to leave the galley, her supervisor gave her one last piece of advice. "Learn how to read the room, and you'll survive. But one more mistake like this, it could cost you everything." The weight of those words hung heavily on the flight attendant's shoulders as she walked back into the main cabin, her heart still pounding in her chest. She had narrowly escaped disaster, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. The tension was still palpable, but no one dared speak a word about what had just transpired. The passengers, who had been watching the exchange with rapt attention, now seemed to settle back into their seats, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a flight from one place to another, it had become a reminder of how fragile power dynamics could be. And for the flight attendant, every glance in the direction of first class was a reminder that in this world, appearances could be deceiving. You never knew who you were truly dealing with, and sometimes, the consequences of a single decision could reach farther than you could ever imagine. The rest of the flight passed in silence. The hum of the engines, once a comforting background noise, now seemed distant and almost irrelevant. Every part of the cabin felt suffocating, as if the air had thickened with the weight of what had happened. The flight attendant, still shaken, found herself walking up and down the aisle, her mind racing as she replayed the events over and over in her head. The woman in first class, the CEO, was no longer just a passenger. She was a symbol of something far bigger. Something that the flight attendant hadn't fully grasped until now. Power. Influence. The kind of power that changed the course of people's lives with the slightest movement of a hand. And the flight attendant had been so naive, so quick to assume that she could control the situation, that she hadn't stopped to think about what she was really dealing with. She paused for a moment, standing by the galley, trying to steady her breathing. She felt the eyes of the passengers on her, but she refused to meet their gaze. She couldn't bear it. The embarrassment was too much. How had she let it get this far? Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the woman, no, the CEO, standing up. She was making her way down the aisle again, walking towards the bathroom at the back of the plane. She moved with the same effortless confidence that had marked her every step earlier. And again, the flight attendant couldn't help but watch, the woman's every movement pulling her attention like a magnet. As the CEO passed by, she glanced at the flight attendant, her eyes locking with hers for a brief, silent moment. There was no malice in her gaze, but there was something else, something unspoken. It was as if the CEO knew exactly what the flight attendant was feeling. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat as she realized that she had been marked by this encounter. And now, she would never be the same. The CEO reached the bathroom and disappeared behind the curtain. The flight attendant stood there, rooted to the spot, until her supervisor approached her once again. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than before, but still carrying a hint of authority. The flight attendant nodded, though the weight of the situation was still pressing down on her. "I'll be fine," she said, though her words felt empty. The truth was, she wasn't sure she would ever be fine again. "Listen," her supervisor said, lowering his voice. You've learned a hard lesson today. But you're lucky. Not everyone gets a second chance. The woman could have made this a lot worse for you, but she didn't. That's not something you can take lightly. I know, the flight attendant replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. I didn't realize who she was. I thought I could just do my job and make her listen. You're not just a flight attendant on a plane, though. You're part of a much bigger picture. You have to understand that now. And you need to be more aware of who you're dealing with. People like her don't just sit in first class because they like the view. They're here for a reason. The words hit her harder than anything he had said before. She had been so caught up in her own world, in her own position, that she had failed to recognize the greater world around her. It wasn't just about serving drinks or following rules. It was about navigating a world full of people who could shape destinies with a single phone call. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, the flight attendant felt a sense of clarity settling in her mind. The woman had shown her something important. It wasn't just about authority or power, it was about respect. She had assumed that her position meant something, that she could control situations with her title and uniform. But she had been wrong. True power didn't come from a job or a uniform. It came from understanding the bigger picture. From knowing who you were, and who others were, and how the two connected. The woman, the CEO, hadn't shown anger. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. Instead, she had let the flight attendant hang herself with her own arrogance. And in doing so, she had taught the flight attendant the most valuable lesson of all: never underestimate the people around you. Never assume you know everything about someone based on appearances. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt signs flickered off, the flight attendant walked to the front of the cabin with a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never make the same mistake again. The world was bigger than she had ever imagined, and now, it was time for her to learn how to navigate it. And as she passed by first class one last time, she couldn't help but glance at the CEO. The woman was already on her phone, speaking quietly but decisively, her posture perfect. And the flight attendant, for the first time, saw her for who she truly was. A woman who commanded respect without ever having to demand it. The lesson was clear, and it was one that the flight attendant would carry with her for the rest of her life. The flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as she moved through the final steps of the flight. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the weight of everything that had transpired lingered in the air. The CEO's presence had left an undeniable mark on her. The woman's quiet power, her ability to control the situation without uttering a word, had taught her more than she ever expected to learn on a routine flight. As she stood by the jet bridge, watching the passengers disembark, she found herself glancing back at first class. The woman was already preparing to leave, gathering her things with the same cool composure she'd shown throughout the entire flight. No rush, no signs of hurry. The flight attendant couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever fully understand what had just happened. She made her way to the back of the plane, where her supervisor was finalizing some paperwork. "You did good," he said, offering her a rare smile. But she could see the concern in his eyes. He knew this experience was weighing heavily on her. "Do you think she'll say something to the higher-ups?" the flight attendant asked, still unsure of what to expect from the aftermath. Her supervisor shook his head. "I don't think so. She doesn't seem the type to make a big deal out of something like this. But it's a lesson, all right. You got off easy today. A lot of people wouldn't." The flight attendant nodded, her mind still reeling. "I never knew. I never thought. You're not the only one. But now you know. The people you deal with on a daily basis, the passengers, you can't just assume you know them. They could be someone who can change your life. Or end it." She swallowed hard. It wasn't just a warning, it was the truth. And the truth had a way of sinking deep into the soul. Her whole world had just shifted in an instant, and she could feel the change settling into her bones. She knew she couldn't go back to thinking she knew everything. She had to approach the world with more caution, more humility. There was too much at stake now. People, powerful people, didn't announce who they were. They moved through the world quietly, unnoticed, until the moment came when their power was revealed. The flight attendant glanced one last time at the CEO, who was now preparing to step off the plane. She had nothing but admiration for the woman, though it was mixed with a lingering sense of fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you cower, it was the kind that made you pay attention. It was a respect for someone who had mastered the game of life and was playing it on her own terms. The CEO turned just before she left the jet bridge, catching the flight attendant's eye. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement. Just a simple, knowing look that seemed to say everything the flight attendant needed to hear. It was as if the woman knew that, by now, the flight attendant had learned the lesson. No more words were needed. "Good luck," the flight attendant whispered to herself, watching the woman disappear into the crowd. The lesson had been learned, but it wasn't over. She would need to take this lesson with her every day from now on, for the world wasn't what it seemed. There were layers beneath the surface, layers that, if you weren't careful, could crush you without warning. The flight attendant took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was next. The day's events had been nothing short of a wake-up call, and she wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she'd be ready for it. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. As the last passenger made their way off the plane, the flight attendant stood by the door, taking one final look around. She thought about the woman in first class, about how quickly the tables had turned, and about how lucky she was that the consequences hadn't been more severe. But in that moment, she realized that luck had little to do with it. It wasn't about fortune or chance. It was about respect, and the lesson that true power wasn't about domination. It was about understanding the dynamics around you, knowing when to act and when to stay still. She had underestimated the woman, and she had learned the hardest way possible that sometimes, the most powerful people in the room don't make a scene. They simply wait for you to realize who they are. And with that, the flight attendant walked off the plane, ready to take the next step in her career, armed with a life lesson that would never fade. As the flight attendant made her way back to the crew area, a sense of calm washed over her, though she knew it wasn't the same kind of peace she had once taken for granted. She had learned something crucial, something that would forever change the way she viewed not just her job, but life itself. It was the end of the shift, but it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The passengers had all left, the plane now empty, and the noise of the cabin had quieted to a mere hum. But for the flight attendant, the echoes of what had transpired lingered, reminding her that nothing in this world was ever as simple as it appeared. The rest of the crew gathered near the doors, chatting about their day, but the flight attendant found herself standing off to the side, processing everything she had experienced. She couldn't forget how easily she had been thrown off balance. One moment, she was doing her job like any other day, and the next, she was face to face with a person whose mere presence had altered the course of her career. But it wasn't just the CEO's power that had struck her, it was the lesson beneath it all. The woman hadn't yelled, hadn't demanded anything. Instead, she had made a quiet, unspoken statement that resonated deeply with the flight attendant. Power wasn't about loud declarations or visible force, it was about influence, about understanding how to move through the world without drawing unnecessary attention. It was about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to make your move and when to wait. The flight attendant finally returned to the break room, where her supervisor stood waiting. He offered her a weary but supportive smile. "I know you've got a lot on your mind," he said, his voice gentle. "But you've got to understand, what you saw today, it happens every day. People in positions like hers, they know how to control situations without saying a word. They understand the power of silence. And that's something that doesn't come easily. It's something earned. She nodded slowly, still processing. I've always believed in doing my job, following the rules. But today showed me that there's more to it. You can't just follow orders and assume you understand everything. You have to recognize the bigger picture. Exactly, he agreed. You'll be a better flight attendant for it, no doubt. But more than that, you'll be a better person. The world's full of people who hide in plain sight. You need to learn how to see them. Recognize who they really are. The flight attendant looked at her supervisor and realized that his words weren't just about the job. They were about life. About the moments when you think you've got it all figured out, only to have something, or someone, come along and shatter that illusion. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. I won't forget this. He gave her a reassuring nod. You shouldn't. Just don't let this be the only lesson you learn. There's always more to see. More to understand. As the day wound down and the last of the crew filtered out of the room, the flight attendant found herself alone for a moment. She leaned against the wall, her mind reflecting on the events that had unfolded that day. The CEO, the woman who had taught her more in a few minutes than some people learned in a lifetime, was someone she would never forget. She wasn't just a business mogul, she was a reminder of everything the flight attendant had missed, everything she had failed to notice in her earlier life. But as she stood there, she realized that the lesson wasn't just about power or influence, it was about humility. It was about recognizing that everyone, no matter how ordinary they may seem, could carry a depth of experience and authority that was invisible at first glance. It was about learning to listen to the world, to pick up on the quiet cues, and to never assume that you were the smartest person in the room. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was this: never underestimate the people around you. Never assume that you know their story, their capabilities, or their power. You may be surprised at how easily you could be wrong. The flight attendant walked out of the break room, her steps light but determined. She was ready for whatever came next. She had learned the hard way, but the lesson had been worth it. She was no longer the same person who had boarded that plane earlier that day. She was someone who had seen the world for what it truly was, a place full of untapped potential, waiting to be understood. And with that, she stepped into her future, armed with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again.